Good evening. There's something about that walk down through that little aisle there that I remember doing that as a child, and it just scares you just a little bit, gets that heart rate going, and I'd be up here doing scripture reading or prayer every once in a while, but it's certainly an honor to be here with you tonight to talk about the text that we have in Genesis chapter 7 and talking about the flood. I remember being a child in one of those classrooms and the song that we would sing about the ark, right? The Lord said to Noah, there's going to be a floody. You remember that song, right? It rained and rained for 40 days and daisies. And I love this little part. And nearly drove those animals crazies, children of the Lord. We were able to be down here on Tuesday night, and I know it's been a great week of just studies of this text that was really, kind of put together through the Apologetics Press. And the first night, you guys talked about the world and how the world that we know as today was really different than the world that we find here in Genesis chapter 6. The world that Noah existed in, it was a world that was different in that they had one language. We see that in Genesis chapter 10. It was a world that probably looked a lot different than the world that we know today. We know that the world at that time did not have rain, had fallen from the sky. That in Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, we see that the world was watered by a mist. So it was different. And then you learned about the man Noah. You learned about his character. You learned about his faith and his obedience and how God chose him, not because he was sinless, being perfect, but that he lived a life that was going to bring honor to God. He lived a life that was preaching to other people about God, telling them to get ready for the flood that was to come. God knew Noah would obey. And then he learned about that ark, right? That vessel. We don't want to call it a ship. It didn't have the equipment that we would think of to deem it a ship, but it was a vessel at least 450 feet long. You think about a football field, right? 360 feet from goalpost to goalpost, and this stretched another 100 feet. This was a massive ship, a massive vessel, but yet intelligently designed, with all the room that it needed for all the animals to come upon the ark. Intelligently designed to withstand a violent storm, intelligently designed to protect the animals in it and for Noah and his family to survive, to live in this vessel for a year. And then last night, I believe Brother John Keith was here and he talked about the animals that were to come upon the ark, right? We know the stories, we sing those songs about 2 by 2s, how those animals came upon the ark, and we know from our biblical texts that it was 2 of the unclean animals. You know, those animals that we love so much, the dogs, the cats, the pigs. How could you go all your life without ever eating bacon? But Noah did. Right? By 2, the unclean animals, and then the clean animals. Right? We think about the clean animals that were on there, the chickens that would have been there, the bovine, all the different cattle that were there. And I wonder, and I don't know if John got into this or not, in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 2, in the Hebrew text it says Shiva Shiva, where possibly instead of just 7, there were 14 each of the clean animals that were brought upon the ark. But in the accounting of the clean animals and the unclean animals, I'm sure that text that John went through last night was about some of those unclean animals, dinosaurs, reptiles, amphibians that were brought upon the ark. And today, I don't know, save the best for last. It isn't because it's the best speaker at all, but this whole week comes down to this moment of Genesis chapter 7. Without the flood, we have no need for Noah. We have no need for an ark. But everything that God had planned, everything that God had predicted, this great flood is what we're going to be looking at today. And so if you would, open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 7. We've got a lot to go through in the next 45 minutes, and I hope to keep us within that time frame. I have gotten long-winded over the last few years. I never thought I would. I never talk very much, but you get me behind a microphone and I will keep you here all night long. So if we're out of here by 10, we're doing good. All right. This is a newspaper article that appeared in 2006 from Kauai. And this is what it says. The good news is that it seems the weather in Hawaii has finally taken a turn for the better with the return of the trade winds. The rains that have pounded the islands for 6 weeks are finally moving out to sea. The bad news is that the islands have suffered from 41 days of rain, all of which began on February 19th and accumulated until Friday, March 31st, with a downpour that quite simply pushed us over the edge. Torrential rain caused severe flooding and property damage, numerous mudslides and flooded roads and neighborhoods throughout the island. Over those 41 days, the islands of Hawaii saw flash floods, landslides, mudslides, a dam break that killed 7 people, 4 of whom, at the time of this writing, were still missing. Nearly 92 inches of rain were recorded during March on Mount Walahele, something like that. And it was considered one of the rainiest spots on the planet. The previous record was 90 inches in April 1971. 92 inches of rain, but that 92 inches of rain over 41 days. Keep that in your mind. As we kind of go through Genesis chapter 7, we look at what happens with Noah and his family. The first thing we want to notice tonight is Genesis chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, that the time has come. The Lord said to Noah, "Come to the ark, you and your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. And you shall take 7 each of every clean animal, his male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female." And he goes through the list of those species. "And after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy the face of the earth and all the living things that I have made." And so Noah did, according to all that God had commanded him. And so here in the very first paragraph of chapter 7, we have really this reminder to Noah of all the work that he has been doing for all these years, for about 120 years or so, that Noah has been building this vessel, that now the time has come for the flood waters to come on the earth. So all that I have warned you in chapter 6, verses 13 through 22, now it's time to take the animals and get them on the ark. It's going to rain for those 40 days. And then not only has the time come, but as we kind of go through this, we see the trusting obedience of Noah. In chapter 7, verses 7 through 9, and also verses 13 through 16, that Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives, they go to the ark. They go into the ark. They receive these animals, 2 each of the unclean, 7 of the clean animals into the ark, and then God shuts the door. And they wait. Could you imagine? Noah is a man of patience, right? We understand him as a man of faith without a doubt, but he's also a man of patience. 120 years building this vessel, and I'm sure the world ridiculing him as he was a preacher of righteousness, and none of those people coming onto this vessel with him. He and the animals squawking, flying around, stinking, and the door is shut, and it's hot weather outside. All right, God, when are you going to send it? We're waiting. But his faith and his trust in God, they continued to wait. And then lastly, throughout chapter 7, we notice the destruction. Verses 10 through 12 and 17 through 24. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 7th month, and 17th day of the month, and that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And then jump down to verse 17. And now the flood was on the earth 40 days, and the waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, cattle, and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all whose nostrils was the breath of life. All that was on the dry land died, so he destroyed all living things that were on the face of the ground, both man, cattle, creeping thing, bird of the air, and they were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him on the ark remained, and the waters prevailed 150 days. The destruction. Right? How quickly does it take us to read that? For those 40 days that the rains came down. It doesn't seem very long. It doesn't seem very horrible as we're kind of going through that. That article that we read of Hawaii, right, talked about torrential downpours and mudslides and flooded roads and a dam breaking. You know, it was detailed of things that were going on. And this account that we have seems not too horrible until you begin to look at the details of this. 40 days of rain. Right, Hawaii here in this story, they were hit with 41 days of rain, and we saw some of the destruction that happened there. And you imagine these 40 days of rain that God sent is a rain like none other. It's a rain that we have never experienced in the history of mankind. The highest rainfall that had ever happened was 71 inches in a 24-hour period back in 1966. And that would pale in comparison to these rains that came for these 40 days that God sent on the earth. And not only did we have rain, what a phenomenon that was for Noah to never experience what rain is. And now these torrential downpours that are coming down. But as we had read through that text, not only rain for 40 days and 40 nights, but all the fountains of the deep broke up. What is that? The fountains of the deep breaking up in verse 11. You know, you think about aquifers that are under the ground. You know, we drill for wells. Well, if we don't have the ability to have city water, we drill in the ground for wells so that we can shower and that we can drink. And so we think about all of the water that is in the ground and shooting up as a fountain, the grounds breaking open, water coming out of them. You know, throughout this destruction, you kind of picture the earth, without a doubt. You think of Psalm 104. The earth changed. It's not what it was back then. Perhaps the tectonic plates and the earth shifting of the plates of the lands. And as those plates move and the ground underneath breaks up, you have molten lava, you have heat. You ever been out to Yellowstone? I don't know, it was after Clarence Soule passed away, and my grandmother, Imogene, insisted that we go out west. And we spent about a month traveling out west, and one of the places we went to was Yellowstone National Park. And I remember standing in the sulfur fields out there, and it just stunk, right? You could just smell the sulfur coming up out of that water. But one of those places in Yellowstone was good old Faithful. Right, every 75 minutes or so, good old Faithful would erupt. This geyser, 200 feet high of water that is about 200 degrees. And then would go back down. About 75 minutes later, it would happen again. And that's all happening because of the heat from fissures under the ground and the groundwater there superheating, and then causing steam and causing that water to boil, and then eventually, once it gets hot enough, erupts out in a geyser form. Imagine that all over the world. Thousands of those happening as the fountains of the deep rip open. You have not only torrential downpours coming down from the rains, but you also have these geysers of water shooting up. 40 days of rain. The fountains of the great deep all broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Maybe this is a reference to, you remember in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 7, when God created everything, we have this idea of the firmament that was above and the land that was below. There's kind of this idea of a suspended water. Perhaps that's what this is. Perhaps it's when the fountains of the deep open up and steam comes up and causing more rain. But maybe these are waterfalls from heaven, right? As the firmament is broken up and opened up, and its water now, instead of being suspended above, is pouring out. Remember, it's never rained before. The water wasn't in vapor form in the clouds above that was ready to come down. There was something about this firmament. And now the windows of heaven opened and poured upon the ground. This wasn't just a rain. And this wasn't just geysers, and it wasn't just waterfalls. But you think about the power of water. This was a violent, destructive force that God brought upon the land, not to water land, but to destroy it. We have these pictures in our minds sometimes about Noah and the ark, and it's all very fanciful, and you got the wonderful giraffe with his head sticking out of the window, right? And it's a very peaceful, serene thought on these beautiful waters of maybe a peaceful lake. Noah had to have great faith to hold on to that ark when these violent waters were beating against that ark. And you think about the vast quantity of water. And you look at verse 17, that as it had rained, it lifted up this ark, right? You think about this barge-like vessel, 450 feet. Now it begins to lift up from the ground, and it begins to lift up from the ground so much, in verse 19, that all the hills are covered under heaven. Every bit of the earth covered by water. There was no land to see. If Noah could look out of the window, if he had invented a telescope, he could look all over, and there's not going to be a mountaintop peeking out of that water. We're told that for 15 cubits, verse 20, the waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered 22 feet higher than the highest point of that time, covered with water. And the vast death as well. All flesh died. All animals, insects, man, everything outside the ark perished in these waters. In the end of chapter 7, verse 24, and the waters prevailed 150 days for 5 months. Right? The rains came down for 40 days, and then after those 40 days, that water still rose higher and higher and higher until we got to 5 months, and then it kind of levels off, and then they begin to recede. And this whole process takes about a year till finally the ark comes to rest on dry ground, and again, Noah patiently waits to come out. That's the biblical story of Noah. There are people, right, these intelligent people who say that there is no way that the flood ever happened. And if it did happen, it was just a local flood that happened where Noah was because of the outpouring of the Mesopotamia, the outpouring of the Euphrates River, and it was just a simple local flood. And so is there any evidence for a worldwide flood? I wanted, when I was back in high school, and you ask those questions of, what do you want to be when you grow up? I told my mom I wanted to be a science teacher, and she got angry at me. And I thought, why are you getting angry? I thought that was a pretty good profession. And she says, if you become a science teacher, you're going to have to teach evolution. Well, she's back there shaking her head. And she was probably right. I would have to. Right? And you think about, as we study science, and I hope that the kids are going through this information and the proofs that exist from science of a worldwide flood, because you will never hear these things, or more likely you wouldn't hear these things in a science classroom in a high school, but they exist. Right? All the things we are taught typically in science is that the world is 4.6 billion years old, and it happened through the Big Bang, a big kind of accident, and we evolved out of some primordial sludge, and through a time process, we evolved from an amoeba, a single-celled organism, to what we are today, complex beings. You and I look at that and you think, you're crazy. And you are right. But there are good teachers who will teach what they need to teach in the book about evolution, about its theory, and those who started that theory. I think about Christy. Christy Robson, who is a faithful Christian woman and a wonderful teacher. And whenever she taught high school or taught history, she also taught biblical history. We can do both things. But here is something that we, as parents and grandparents, we need to watch out for, is the falsehood that is taught to our kids and our grandkids. Ernst Haeckel. You probably never heard of the name of Ernst Haeckel, but Ernst Haeckel, back in 1868, he was a staunch teacher of evolution. And he did some studies of human development. And he drew the embryos and the development of humans within the womb. And then not only did he do that, but he also equated those things with other animals. Fish, monkeys, right? And all throughout our textbooks, even though it came out very soon after he drew these things that they were false, that they were doctored up, they weren't as accurate as they should have been, our textbooks, even 5 years ago, still had the Ernst sketches showing the identical development between human and animals to prove evolution. They knew it was false, but they're still printed in our high school textbooks today. So we have to be careful about the conclusions that are drawn from science, right? This idea of true science is observation and also experimentation. What can we observe to show that the flood was a worldwide flood, that it actually did happen the way that we find out throughout the Scripture? one thing we need to be reminded of is the world is not the same. Peter warns us of that the world isn't the same today as it was back then. 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 5, he says, "For this they willfully forget." How many people willfully forget these things? They choose to forget it. "That by the word of God the heavens were of old, and that the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world then that existed perished," being flooded with water. Everything isn't always the same. The world isn't the same today as it was in the day of Noah. Peter warned us of that. So there are some things that change, some things that happened to this planet that we live on that will show us that this flood indeed happened, and it's a worldwide catastrophic flood. Here's some evidences. Number one, logic. Why in the world? If this is, that's ironic, why in the world? If this is a local flood, I'm glad you get my humor. If this is a local flood, why take all the time, 120 years? Why take all the resources of sourcing gopher wood? Why bring all these animals to Noah to get on this vessel if this is a local flood? That is simply illogical to do that. 2, rocks. Rocks are fun. You ever have a pet rock? My kids, I don't know why, they would pick up rocks from wherever they were at. Sometimes you would have to discipline them a little bit because we would be at a restaurant like Texas Roadhouse or Applebee's, and they have in their landscaping rocks. Ooh, that's a pretty rock, and we're going to take it home. Well, you do enough of that, they're not going to have any rocks there, and they're all going to be in your bedroom. But rocks, right? The surface of the earth. The surface of the earth is made up of 90% sedimentary rock. You remember back in probably grade school what sedimentary rock is, right? It's rock that is formed layer after layer after layer as silt, sand, mud, minerals settle, typically in water. And then with some time, with some pressure, it hardens, it dries, and it becomes rock. 90% of the world is made up of this type of rock. And the really kind of cool thing about this, we understand it. Sometimes we don't make the parallels. But why are they drilling for Marcellus Shale in Washington, Pennsylvania? Why are they drilling it here? Why are they drilling it out in Ohio? Now they're starting to drill the Utica, and they're going to be doing that in Pennsylvania too, and they can do it all throughout the United States. It's because there is this layer of sedimentary rock that is the same. That's what Utica is. It's shale. It's sedimentary rock. And that we're using it for fuel. But there are these layers that are intercontinental. Right? The same layers that we have here in the United States can be found in the same layer in Australia. Isn't it kind of odd that 90% of the earth has sedimentary rock and here and there are the same layers? How does that happen? Well, if there's a worldwide flood and the whole world is covered with water, and as that water settles, everything got kicked up when the fountains of the deep opened up, and when the windows of heaven opened up, and the rains came down, and as that water calms, after those 150 days, and things started to settle down, and the water started receding, and those layers began to be laid upon each other, that would explain a worldwide flood. Logic, rocks, marine fossils. All right, who wants to be a marine biologist? You hear that all the time when kids are growing up and they're in high school. What do you want to do? I want to be a marine biologist. You want to go swimming in the oceans, what you want to do, don't you? Yep, pretty much. All right, our world looks different than it did then. All right, Peter reminded us of that in 2 Peter chapter 3. Land masses broke up. the earth was covered with water. And as the earth is covered with water, what do you have? You have sea life. They're still alive, right? You still have whales. Massive blue whales, right? That's the largest mammal. Am I correct in saying that? I believe so. The largest mammal in the world, all the way down to little krill. All over the face of the earth. And what happens to them as the waters recede? And as the waters receding and these plates are still being moved and mountains are rising up, what happens? You get sea life that's deposited on these mountain ranges. If you go to the Grand Canyon, in the Grand Canyon, there are marine fossils in every single layer of the Grand Canyon, even at the top. The top is 8,000 feet above sea level, and even at the top of that, on that limestone, there are clams, there are corals, there are sea lilies and sea snails, and even fish teeth that are found. And somebody would say, well, duh. All right, wasn't the Grand Canyon carved by the Colorado River? All right, well, how about this? The Himalayan mountains. All right, some of the tallest mountain ranges that we have within this world, 29,000 feet above sea level. And guess what we find there? The same thing we find in Colorado at the Grand Canyon. Sea life, fossils on those 29,000 feet peaks of the Himalayan mountains. David says in Psalm 104 and verse 8, he says in regards to this great flood, he says, the mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you have appointed for them. And that's from the ESV. The mountains continued to rise, the valleys continued to sink as the waters receded. And during that whole time, sea life was deposited throughout the entirety of the world. It gives us evidence of a worldwide flood. Logic, rocks, marine life, and death. Death gives us evidence of a worldwide flood. We believe in a young earth. 6,000 to 10,000 years since God created everything that we know and everything that we see in those 6 days. Roughly from the time of creation to the flood of Noah is about 1,650 years. And what was happening through those 1,650 years? People were doing what God commanded them to do. Populate the earth. Animals reproduced after their own kind. People were populating the earth. There was activity and there was growth. Each layer of the earth is called strata, and it's kind of like the rings of a tree. It tells a story of the environment that is going on of the day. There is this before the flood strata called the Cambrian, and we refer to it kind of pre-Cambrian, pre-flood strata. And guess what isn't really found there? Fossils. But we have this other strata line that is referred to as the Cambrian explosion. Because guess what's there? A huge amount of fossils. Well, why do we go from not a whole lot of fossil evidence at all to all of a sudden thousands of fossils able to be found? Well, if the world was being populated and there was all of these animals on the face of the earth, and only Noah and his 3 children and their wives were on the ark, and all they took was 2 of each unclean animal and 7 of each of clean animals, there is going to be a lot of death that happens. Here's the interesting thing about this. A paleontologist, Stephen Gould, says that this layer of fossils that appear with absolute no evolutionary history and effectively reflects the beginning of the fossil record. So what's he say? Kind of a dinosaur doctor, right? He says, there is no evidence of evolution that happened until we get to this point. Well, what was going on before then, right? If we were coming up out of primordial sludge, there's going to be those ape-like humans, right? There's going to be those fish that had feet that walked on dry land. Where are those? They're not there. There is no evidence of evolution prior to this period. There's no fossil record prior to that. Why now all of a sudden do we have all these fossils? For us, it's because of the flood. Richard Dawkins, right, he's still around. It is as though these fossils were just planted there with no evolutionary history. Charles Darwin said about the Cambrian explosion, he says, of the fossils, it's a problem for his evolutionary theory. Isn't that ironic? Right? These scientists knew this was a problem, but instead of talking about it, we'll just completely dismiss it, right? And we'll still push our theory. That is not true science. That is not observation through experimentation. And there are many other evidences that go to show us that the flood was a worldwide flood. The flood that we read in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. To wrap up tonight, I'm not sure what time I'm supposed to quite finish, but I know it's before 8. Just a couple things, a couple applications for us to make of this. You know, this is a lot of evidence, it's a lot of information that comes to us, and I hope, you know, for us who are parents and grandparents, we have children who are learning these things in school about evolution, that we can use some of these facts and some of these informations and some of these evidences to show them that maybe what they're being taught isn't quite as accurate as it's made out to be. But here's something that we can tell them that we know without a doubt, because of the facts, because of the evidence, that God's Word is trustworthy. Thy Word is truth. Psalm 119, 160. We can believe and we can have full trust that when God says there was a worldwide flood that covered the whole face of the earth, that rose to the highest peak, even 22 feet above that we can trust that it happened. And it's not a blind trust, but it's a trust based off of the evidences that we have. Spiritual application number 2. There's going to be times in your life where you go through your own flood. Mom usually tries to keep us updated on things that are going on here at Hillview. And there's a lot of sickness. There's a lot of grief. There's a lot of death that happens. There's a lot of sadness. There's a lot of good things that are going on too. But at some point in our life that we go through some very horrible things in our life. You think about Noah inside of this ark. It was a test of his faith. It was a test of his patience. It was a test of his trust and how he was inside of that ark. And even though the violence that was going on outside the ark, you know, sometimes when we go to the doctor, we might get some news that we don't want to hear. Sometimes when we sit across the dinner table of a plate that's already set up, and that person's never coming there because they've already passed on, but yet it's been so many years that I set a plate for them, where we're going through that grief. Sometimes the flood of our life might be whenever we're going through some marriage troubles. Maybe it's whenever, we've been having trouble paying the bills, but we walk into work and we get handed a layoff slip saying, well, sorry, the economy's tanking and we can't afford you any more. We're going to go through those times, but we remember His patience, remember God's protection of Him while He was in that ark. And remember that while we're going through those difficult times, the flood of Noah, it receded. And he was able to walk out on dry land. So when we're going through some hard times in our life, remember that if we remain faithful to God, the floods in our life will recede too. Our mourning will be turned to dancing, to joy one day. Spiritual application number 3. Remember God's power and His promise. You think about all those people who were outside the ark. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, Noah by faith being divinely warned of things not yet seen. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, for God did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, a preacher of righteousness. We think about Noah and how he proclaimed to the world that was round about him of this devastating flood that's going to happen. He spent his life telling others to be ready and to be warned, but yet they did not obey. They did not believe him. And just as the flood waters came, it was too late. God had already shut the door. He had shut that door 7 days before the flood waters came. Noah warned them of what was going to happen. And in that same way, we understand that Jesus will come back. Peter's warned us of this in 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 10. He says, but that day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a fervent heat, and with a great noise, and the elements will melt with a fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Jesus is going to come back. We don't know when, but we know He's coming back, and He's going to come back as a thief in the night. There's not going to be all kind of warning signs that He's coming, that we get prepared for it, as in the days of Noah, right? They were feasting. They were having the time of their lives. The sun was still out. The ground was still dry. Noah was shut up in the ark with the animals, and then the rain came. We are warned that Jesus will come back. Are we ready? You think about Noah being saved, or as a reminder of God's power and His promises. Noah was saved by the ark. You think about that story, right? You think about Noah being saved, and he's saved because he's on this huge vessel that he created, of God giving him instruction. But when we go to the book of Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 20, we're told that it wasn't by the ark that he was saved, but it was by, you know it, water. Well, that seems kind of weird, doesn't it? How was it that Noah was saved by water? He was saved from that wicked and perverse generation. And once the divine, long-suffering God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. There is also an antitype. There is something very similar to that in our day and age. And he says baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience towards God. We are people who need to heed a warning. We live in a world where there are people who need to heed the warning that Jesus is coming back. How are they going to be saved? Not by ark, but they're going to be saved by water, through baptism. Noah in the flood is a picture of water destroying flesh, destroying sin, destroying wickedness, so that he and his family can be saved. Baptism, in the very same way, it destroys sin, it destroys wickedness in our own lives. If we believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, if we're willing to turn away from that sin, if we're willing to die to ourselves, in Romans chapter 6, right, verses 1 through 6, that we are buried in that water grave and come up as a new creation. That's the warning that each of us need to heed. Have we done that? That water saves because within it is the power of the saving blood of Christ Jesus. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Mark 16, verse 16. Do you have a need to answer the warning that we are reminded of from the flood of Noah? If you need to answer that call to become a child of God, to be baptized so that you can be saved, will you come together as we stand and as we sing?